All right, well, thank you very much for having me. And for people who are tuning in and are here live, thank you very much again for being here and being in my audience. You know, it's always a pleasure for me to be here. Just a very quick intro for people who have never listened to me or tuned in before. I'm David Lee of Strong by Lee. I'm a solopreneur based out of White Plains, New York. I am also a registered dietitian and a personal trainer. My goal is to help people get fit, help people get healthy, and the way that I do that is through personalized fitness and nutrition coaching. I have another tagline, but I figured that I'll drop the tagline later on. We're going to talk about heart health today, and I'm going to spare you all the depressing. I'm going to spare you a lot of the depressing stuff about the heart, because we know that heart disease is a problem in the U.S., right? Because it is the leading cause of death, and a lot of heart disease is preventable. 1 in 4 deaths are caused by heart disease, and that includes hypertension, stroke, heart disease, and all these things. That equates to about over 650,000 deaths per year. We don't know how many of those deaths are preventable, but some of those deaths are. I mean, of course, you have old age, but then there are many people who succumb to heart disease simply because of lifestyle behaviors. And heart disease isn't only just an individual problem, it's a societal problem too. Back in 2014 to 2015, they estimated that heart disease cost the medical system $220 billion. Heart disease certainly puts a massive strain on just society's health, just health in general, individual, community, society. And it doesn't look good in terms of how we're going to be managing heart health moving forward, because the statistics are holding steady. Now, there are some statistics showing that life expectancy is decreasing. It started decreasing back in 2017. That's the first time it started decreasing in decades. It's not because of heart disease. It's a contributing factor, but I'm going to say this, it doesn't have anything to do with heart disease, but the main reason that life expectancy is decreasing is because of drug overdoses. But heart disease is still up there. It's contributing to the decreased life expectancy. Okay, now that the bad news is over with, we're going to probably take a more of an optimistic twist. Now, for me, I don't really work with many people with heart disease, because usually heart disease afflicts people who are more advanced in age, over the age of 60. I have worked with people with heart disease. I've worked with people with pacemakers. One of my most dedicated clients is a cardiologist in Westchester. We talk about heart disease a lot. We talk about her clients. I mean, obviously she doesn't tell me the names of her patients, but we talk about her work. We talk about what she does to help her clients, help her clients improve their heart health. And what's interesting is you don't really need to get that technical about it. There are some basic fundamental things about your heart. If you take care of it, you pretty much can take care of almost anything else. What's interesting is if you follow a sound nutritional plan, and I'm going to use that 4-letter word, diet, then you can check off a lot of boxes, because a sound nutritional plan supports all of your organs, almost all of your organs. Of course, it has to be personalized and not everything is the same. For example, if you are diabetic, you're probably not going to eat the same as somebody who has kidney disease, or whatever the case is, right? But when it comes to heart health, a lot of times a good heart health diet will support almost all of your other organs, notwithstanding. We're going to go through some of those things. We're also going to go through, I don't know if I can demonstrate some exercises because I'm doing some rearranging in this room. It's a little bit messy, but I can certainly write some exercises you can do. And they're basic too, because I assume many people who are tuning in here they're not super athletes. You're not competitive athletes. You're probably not getting paid to work out. And even within this pandemic, you probably have a difficult time getting to the gym. And if you do, hats off to you. I commend you, because that's a really tough thing to pull off. For most people, just doing some easy, long duration exercise where you lift the heart rate and you keep it lifted for a long period of time is more than enough to keep your heart healthy. And we're going to talk about the number one underlying cause of heart disease and disease in general, and that is inflammation. Inflammation tends to be at the root of a lot of chronic diseases, especially lifestyle preventable ones. Just think about how stressed you get on a normal day-to-day basis. If you don't get stressed out, then that's really good, because most people are stressed out. I mean, we've had a mental health crisis before this pandemic, and it's gotten exacerbated because of this pandemic. And mental health, emotional health, has a really strong tie-in with cardiovascular disease, stress, and inflammation. So if we can figure out a way to help people manage stress and inflammation, your heart is going to thank you for it. And so we'll knock off all those things, and we'll talk about a couple of books that I like. And really, there aren't too many books that I read that's geared towards heart health. Why? Because as a registered dietitian, and I'm reading all these studies, even the studies, one study will come out saying, oh, well, this is good for heart health. And then the next week, another study will come out and be like, well, this isn't good because the studies previously refuted this, or we don't have enough evidence. Science is great, but it's a trial and error, and we can't take any study that comes out showing some sort of promise at face value. We have to take it with a grain of salt. We have to put it up to the scrutiny of scientific inquiry. So there aren't that many books that I would recommend right away. However, there are a couple. The number one book that I recommend is by a PhD. I recommend this book to a lot of my clients. It's called Why We Get Sick. Why We Get Sick by Benjamin Bikman. He studies the role of insulin, which is a hormone that's released by your pancreas. That was a direct message to me, Z. You want to send it to everybody. So it's called Why We Get Sick by Benjamin Bikman. It's this book right here. Let me get it for you. This one, Why We Get Sick by Benjamin Bikman. It's not that long of a book, maybe like 200 pages. It's very quick, very simple. It's written for the lay person, so that's not very technical either. But he underlines how uncontrolled blood sugars and insulin and a diet high in carbohydrates is one of the leading contributing factors to almost all chronic diseases that we know of: diabetes, cancer, kidney disease, heart disease, any sort of cognitive issues, brain disease. So insulin and uncontrolled blood sugar tend to be married. They go hand in hand with inflammation. All right, we're going to talk about some of those things. Before we get started, do we have any questions? I don't know. I'm just going to go out on a limb here. I hope any of the listeners here, you don't have any serious heart conditions, and if you do, I hope this talk does help you. My stepfather, who has taken care of me since I was probably about 9-10 years old, he has high blood pressure and high cholesterol, and for the longest time, he was healthy. He was fine. He had weight issues, right? And this is one of the big things. A lot of people believe that, oh, I don't have high blood pressure or any of these things. I may be overweight, I'm inactive, but I don't have any of the markers. My blood chemistry doesn't show that I have heart disease, so I should be fine, right? Yes and no. At the moment, you may be okay. But just how hubris and a little bit of, I would say, negligence affected my stepfather, it affects a lot of Americans. All of a sudden, one day, you might just wake up like, you know what? My health is taking a turn for the worse. And it's not because, and this is a little bit pessimistic. A lot of times when people say, 40 is the new 20, there's some truth to that, not because we are living longer. Our life expectancy in the US is 79 years old on average. We are certainly living longer. Infant mortality is almost an afterthought. We've got a lot of infectious diseases under control. But there is a delayed effect on our health. How we live in our 20s and 30s tend to manifest themselves 20, 30 years later. So in a way, 40 is the new 20 because how you lived in your 20s may manifest itself when you're in your 40s, especially if you don't turn things around, because it's the law of compounding. It's a cumulative effect, the law of compounding interest. I don't even know if a financial term can be applicable to health. I'm just going out on a limb there. But that's what I notice with a lot of my clients, especially the ones who are coming in. They want to start getting fit. They want to get on a new routine, and they have some health issues. But they have health issues because when we look at their history, they lived a certain lifestyle when they were younger, and they were just they're just playing catch up. So while that might not sound like good news for a lot of people, the good news is it is accumulative. So even if even if some people lived a certain way 20, 30 years ago, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're resigned to a certain fate. You could certainly change it. And it's much easier than what people think. I've had clients come to me with high blood pressure and high cholesterol, and after some easy tweaks, I'm not talking about a complete overhaul, but after some easy tweaks to their nutrition and making sure that they get exercise. The exercise doesn't even have to be going overboard. You don't have to work out 5, 6, 7 days a week at the gym for an hour each day. You don't have to invest 10 hours per week in exercise. It can be as simple as maybe an hour and a half of targeted, intelligent, and personalized exercise. They've been able to get down their cholesterol to normal ranges, their high blood pressure to normal ranges, and get off medication within a couple of months. And that's perfectly feasible. Is it difficult? Exactly. Will it take time? Yes, it all depends on how long maybe you've had the disease. It depends on how severe your disease is and how much dosage of your medication that you're on. But it's for a vast majority of people, it's not too late. All right. Any questions before we move on? No. I guess not. Okay. The number one thing that I alluded to this before, I talked about it in the middle of my introduction, talk about nutrition. The number one thing, if you can control, and by the way, we're not going to go through like the blood markers. We're not going to talk about HDL, LDL, total cholesterol, triglycerides. We're not going to talk about those things because if we focus too much on the numbers, I think we're going to miss the big picture. The big picture is inflammation. The big picture is physical stress, emotional stress, psychological stress, inflammation, and uncontrolled blood sugar. Those are really the key things that we want to get under control. So the first thing I ask you to do is just think about your day-to-day and rate how stressed out you are. On a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 is you're always stressed out, for example, let's say you work full time and you have young kids, that's very, very stressful. Let's say you work full time, you have young kids, you have ailing parents, that's very, very stressful. If you don't have a job, if you have a job you really like, you don't have kids, you have a lot of free time to do your own things, maybe your stress isn't nearly as high. Why don't you rate or just think about what your day-to-day is like and try to get some inventory on your stress levels. When health experts look at the healthiest civilizations, the healthiest people who are currently living, centenarians like the Seventh-day Adventists, Okinawans, people who live in the Greek islands, people who eat the Mediterranean diet. A lot of people believe that the Mediterranean diet is the healthiest diet, and it could be. Obviously, it could be. The one thing that these health experts find in common with these societies is that they generally have lower levels of stress. As Americans, I was born in the US, I'm an American. One of the key things that separates Americans from the rest of the world, not the rest of the world, I wouldn't say the rest of the world, certainly not certain parts of Asia like South Korea and Japan, but there is a culture of work and hustle in the US. I'm a millennial. I'm 34 years old, and I grew up being told to work. I gotta work. If I want to be successful, if I want to make something of myself, I have to work. If I have to work 2 or 3 jobs, you got to do it. Work off that debt, do things that you don't like doing, hustle and grind, keep building, keep working yourself up that ladder. And that's the message that I've been told ever since I can remember, ever since I started working. Well, I think some of that trend, some of that messaging, that ideology is coming to a head where you're getting millennials burning out. They're getting burnt out because maybe they got themselves involved in a job they don't really like. They're stressed out. The workplace is corrosive and toxic. They might not like their boss or whatever. And not even just millennials. We're talking about the Gen X people before the millennials. Maybe we're talking about the baby boomers, who again grew up in a culture of work and hustle. And as a result, other things started to get crowded out. Things that actually supported our hearts. What Western research is finding now, in addition to the nutrition and how nutrition contributes to inflammation and stress, is mindfulness and meditation. We're going to talk about that after the nutrition. When we're talking about nutrition, I started talking about mindfulness and meditation. Sorry, I went off track a little bit, but okay. So inflammation and stress, inflammation and stress. I talk about this a lot. It might not seem like it because I just made a huge digression. We just took a major left turn, but I assure you I talk about this a lot. I mentioned the Mediterranean diet earlier, but according to Benjamin Bickman in Why We Get Sick, the best diet to control blood sugar is a low carb diet. And if you combine a low carbohydrate diet with what's called intermittent fasting is when you confine your eating to a certain window, and then everything else outside of that window you're not eating. That's called intermittent fasting. And the most common methodology of intermittent fasting is 16-8, meaning you choose an 8-hour block anytime during the day, and you decide to eat in that 8 hours. You don't have to eat the whole 8 hours, but let's say you typically eat 3 meals per day. You would try to eat your 3 meals within that 8-hour period. Most people will find that they can't eat nearly as much within that 8-hour period. And that really is the essence of intermittent fasting. And then the other 16 hours, you're not eating anything. For example, let's say your last bite is at 8 p.m. tonight. You're not going to eat until 16 hours later. 8 a.m. the next day is 12 hours. You tack on 4 more hours to that, 12 p.m., noon. So if you do intermittent fasting, you're not eating until noon the next day. That's considered your breakfast. During those 16 hours, you're not having anything that contains calories. That includes cream or half and half in your coffee. You can have coffee because coffee doesn't have any calories. You can have unsweetened tea. You can have water, but no calories at all. And then at noon, that's when you have your breakfast, which is your meal, the meal that breaks your fast. And a lot of times people find that they can't. Let's say you're eating on a normal day, you eat 2,500 calories. Most people do not find that they can squeeze in 2,500 calories using the same meals within an 8-hour period because they get full. And really, that is the essence of intermittent fasting. Gives people a construct, a schedule, gives them directives on when to eat. So if you are having a hard time losing weight, and weight is a big predictor of heart disease, if you are having a hard time losing weight, intermittent fasting can help because it dictates when you're actually eating, and when you actually eat can dictate your hormones, and those hormones are responsible for making you hungry or making you full. So if you have to eat the same amount, if you have to try to fit in the same amount of calories in a shorter amount of time, you're going to get full. You're going to stay full because you're not going to have as much break in between. So intermittent fasting is number one. And also on top of Why We Get Sick by Benjamin Bickman, there was a researcher named Jason Fung. Jason Fung, F-U-N-G. I'm going to type it right in here. Jason Fung. He has several books out. He has a book called The Obesity Code, The Diabetes Code, The Cancer Code. He has these codes, and he believes that a combination of intermittent fasting and a low carb diet will will really help people get control of their diabetes and their heart disease. A low carb diet, what does that look like? It's not a ketogenic diet. Now, a ketogenic diet, I'm just going to say this really quickly, just so that we can differentiate between what a low carb diet is and a ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet is characterized by high fat intake. You're getting 60 to 70% of your daily calories through fat. You're consuming high amounts of avocado, butter, and cream, and it sounds like a really good diet because you can have steak all you want because that's part of the ketogenic diet. And very low carbs, less than 50 grams of carbs. And what does 50 grams of carbs look like? One apple has 25 grams of carbs. One apple already clears out half of the proposed number of calories that you would have in a ketogenic diet. 1 cup of rice, 1 cup of cooked rice would knock you out of 50 grams. 1 cup of rice. So just to give you some perspective, and I will say the average American eats over 350 grams of carbs per day. 350 grams of carbs per day. It might be difficult to get some perspective on that, but a low carb diet, which again has been proposed to be the most effective, not 100%, but the most effective at handling and controlling heart disease, you're eating less than 150 grams of carbs per day on a low carb diet. So again, the ketogenic diet, less than 50 grams of carbs, but really high in fat. Low carb diet, you might be kind of in the middle. You might be at 40 to 40% of your daily calories through fat, 30 to 40% in carbohydrates. And 30-40% in carbohydrates for most people is about 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates. Again, just to give you some perspective, 1 apple is 25 grams of fat, 25 grams of carbohydrates. A cup of cooked rice has about 50 grams of carbohydrates. 1 banana has about 30 grams of carbohydrates. I would say a serving, which is about, depending on the type of cereal, a serving of cereal will have about 25 to 30 grams of carbohydrates. And a serving of cereal, maybe half a cup, 2/3 of a cup. So next time you want to do an experiment to see how much you're actually eating, get measuring cups, measuring spoons. Measuring spoon is really beneficial if you want to measure out oil. If you want to measure out oil, see how much, if you cook at home, that is. If you want to measure out oil, see how much oil you're cooking, use measuring spoons. Measuring cups to measure out how much things like rice you're eating. I don't know, a lot of my clients, before they see me, they believe that eating a fruit cup or a fruit salad in the morning is really healthy, and it can be depending on how your body processes carbs and what you actually need. But a typical fruit salad in the morning would have over 100 grams of sugar. Fruits in moderation can be very healthy, but at the end of the day, they also contain sugars and carbohydrates. So if you want to see how much of other stuff you eat, get some measuring cups. And if you're really curious at how much you're eating and what you're eating, get a food scale. If you go on Amazon, I don't know if people here support Amazon, it doesn't matter. Find a food scale that measures how much you eat in ounces and grams, and then that will give you, in terms of volume and weight, how much you're eating. Whenever I work with clients, the number one recommendation, the number one tool that I will recommend is getting a food scale. And 9 times out of 10 people have never used a food scale before. And that's really interesting because people should know. You should know how much you're eating if you want to be in 100% control of your health. You should absolutely know what you're eating. Okay, so those are the tools that you can go for: low carb and intermittent fasting, the general overarching methodology, the diet program that has been shown to be the best for heart health in terms of controlling HDL, LDL, triglycerides. And when you combine all 3, it creates your total cholesterol levels. But most importantly, what a lot of people might not consider when it comes to heart health is insulin and blood sugar. people who are diabetic tend to have higher rates of heart disease because diabetes, the kidney, the heart, they're connected. So diabetes will destroy the kidney function. Your kidney is responsible for filtering out water, filtering urine, all these things. And if your kidney doesn't work properly, then it's going to really affect the heart. There's a direct link. It's called the renal heart link. I believe that's the word. It's like the cardiac renal link. So your heart and your kidney, they work in tandem, and if one suffers, the other one is going to suffer. And diabetes absolutely just pounds away at the kidney. So we can talk about some specific foods that you can go for. Any questions so far? How we doing, Z?
All is quiet. I think you've been giving us a lot to think about. If anybody wants to unmute, please unmute, and you can ask your question directly, or you can type it into the chat and I can read it. I do have one in the chat that was sent to me. They were talking about food scales. Now, a big one, a small one, like, do you have, I know you said that one that measures all the grams and the etc.
I put one in the chat. It's called Osary. I think it's $15, and I think it can weigh up to about 2 kilos, which is about 4 pounds. Don't quote me on it. I have it in my cupboard. I used to use it a lot, and I use it as demonstrations to my clients, but I haven't had to use it in a long time. But Osary, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's $15. It's a food scale. It's a small one. Yeah, Liz. I think Wally. In the past. Hi, Liz. I think Wally in the past has mentioned that he has a food scale, used a food scale or something similar. But I hope if there's silence and I'm giving people a lot to think about, it's a good thing. Usually when somebody talks a lot and there's silence, it's probably because I hope I'm not getting too technical or going over people's heads.
Can I ask about the intermittent fasting, just one thing? The sumo wrestlers of Japan, sumo wrestlers in Japan actually have a similar program in that. They do not eat breakfast at all. They wake up in the morning. They have a fairly athletic morning of practicing wrestling. Then in the midday, they eat this gigantic meal. Then they sleep. Then in the evening, they do it again. Now, granted, they are active, so they aren't couch potato type heavy people. They are active, but nonetheless, they do practice intermittent fasting, and it translates to 600 and 700 pound men. So, is that the sumo training regimen, has that given you any thought to any weaknesses in intermittent fasting? Because they do really follow what you said.
Yes, Chris, that's a very good question, which is why I mentioned intermittent fasting should be combined with a low carb diet.
Right.
The thing with the sumo wrestlers is that they have a really high carbohydrate diet, lots of rice. That's the most common thing, right?
Right.
And they just pound it. They pound bowls and bowls of rice. One of my good friends, one of my good friends, he is friends with a sumo wrestler, and that's exactly how they eat, right? And then you also mentioned they sleep afterwards, because there's another thing. I don't know if people are familiar with food coma or fooditis. After Thanksgiving, you eat so much, you get so tired and lethargic. That's usually what happens, and that's what happens when you eat so much. Yes, Liz, like, yeah, it happens to a lot of us, right? It happens to a lot of us, especially when we have good food. Oh man, I'm gonna be the first to admit that I get into food comas when I'm not a foodie, but I'm not like most personal trainers in which my diet is 100% clean. But like if there's a good meal, then especially during the winter, beef stew or any sort of stew. I can kill some really good stew. But I think, Chris, you make a good point. I think the methods of the sumo wrestlers, and to be sure, not all sumo wrestlers are heavy. There are, because they have weight classes. Some sumo wrestlers are thin and they're very lean, and you see that now in the sumo wrestling culture, where they're placing less emphasis on just being big and more about, like you said, athletic. They're very athletic. They're very quick. They're very strong, despite how big they are. I'm going to do an aside just to kind of give you an example of. So the number one weightlifter in the world, his name is Lasha. Lasha Talagdasi. He is 6'6", and weightlifting. When you look at the Olympics, the weightlifters, the ones who are doing the snatches, when they're going over their head like this, and then they do clean and jerks where they come down and then they press up the weights. That's Olympic weightlifting. Lasha is 6'6", 375 pounds. Big man. He's from the country of Georgia. He has the world record and is not even close. So the snatch where he goes over his head like this, that's at 220 kilos. That's 484 pounds he's holding over his head like this. And then the clean and jerk, which is, he has the weight here, and then from here he goes above his head like this. If you look it up, his name is Lasha. It's insane. He's put up 580 pounds that way, 264 kilos. And the guy has a humongous gut. He's 6'6", 375 pounds. Despite that size, he can do a backflip from standing. He's so athletic, so fast, but he has a humongous gut. And I imagine later on, even as athletic and as strong as he is right now, he's going to have heart issues later on because of his excess weight and, of course, the weightlifting. They all are kind of connected. So yes.
Hi, it's Debbie. How do you spell his name? I want to look it up later on.
Lasha Talagdasi. I think that's how you spell it. Yeah.
Oh, someone. Oh, thank you. And can you put your info as well, your email from the last time? I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Thank you.
No. Thank you. Oh, David at strongbylee.com. But Chris, thank you. Did that answer your question, Chris?
Yes, it did. I know they eat a stew called shankanobe, which it does not look fattening because it has a lot of vegetables in it. You'd be fooled. You think, oh, I could get skinny eating this, actually by looking at it. But there's beer in it and pork stock, things like that. So yeah.
Gotcha.
But yeah, that is.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep.
Perfect. Now, if we tie all of this in with, what kind of foods are good? Generally, if we're going to do intermittent fasting with the low carb diet, I will say, before you embark on any sort of nutrition program, I would recommend just to, cover everyone's butt, including mine, reach out to your doctor, especially if you trust your doctor. Ask your doctor, be like, hey, look, I want to lose some weight. I definitely especially if your doctor has said, hey, look, I think it'll be beneficial for you to look after your heart. Then, ask them if it would be appropriate for you to undergo a nutritional program. And then if that's the case, just reach out to me. Email me, david@strongbylee.com, and I'd be more than happy to, spend a few minutes with you trying to hash something out. If we're going to tie all of this in, intermittent fasting, low carb. So intermittent fasting is pretty easy. You choose 8 hours during a day where you are comfortable eating. And then all the other time, you're not having any calories. You can have water, unsweetened tea, unmitigated, unadulterated coffee, and nothing that has calories. And then the 8 hours, now we're looking at a low carb diet that has moderate fat, moderate protein, and moderate carbohydrates. So here we go. I'm going to type this in. So ideally, we want about 30% protein. And these numbers might not make any sense to you right now, but that's okay. We're gonna kind of figure it out. And then 30 to 40% carbohydrates. Okay, I typed it in. 30% protein, 30% fat, about 30 to 40% carbohydrate, makes out to be about 100%. The fat can be 30 to 40%. And these percentages really won't make sense until we figure out how many calories you should actually be eating per day. A lot of people don't know how many calories they're eating per day. That's not necessarily bad, but if you want to see the best possible results, figuring out how many calories you eat per day is very, very important. If you're somebody who likes to go out and eat, that it's going to be even more difficult to track how many calories you're eating. If you are somebody who cooks a lot at home, or let's say you make prepared foods, but the prepared foods have a nutrition label and you know exactly how much you're eating despite not having to really cook it yourself, it'll be easier for you to track your food. You also have apps and programs out there that can kind of give you an idea of how much you're eating. Myfitnesspal is probably the most popular one. Myfitnesspal has a running database that if you put in a certain food or put in a brand, you can even scan the barcode. It'll give you the nutrition label, nutrition facts. Once you get used to something like food tracking, just to kind of get an idea of how many calories you're eating, it's much easier to get a sense of how much protein, fat, and carbohydrate you should be eating per day. Just to give you an example, most people don't know that one whole egg has 60 to 70 calories, depending on the size of the egg, medium, large, extra large, jumbo. A jumbo egg will have 80 calories, has about 7 grams of protein, has 6 grams of fat, no carbs at all. Eggs, and that's a whole egg. An egg white has half of that. Egg white has half the protein. So half the protein that you find in an egg is actually found in the yolk. A lot of people don't know something like that. A lot of people don't know how many carbohydrates are in a serving of fruit. A lot of people don't know how much pasta and rice they should be eating per day. So number one thing is try to figure out how many calories you're eating, and then once you figure out how many calories you're eating, then you want to figure out, at this level of calories I'm eating at, am I gaining weight? Am I staying the same? Or am I losing weight? If you figured out that you're eating 2,500 calories per day and your weight hasn't changed in the past year, you know that eating 2,500 calories is what's called your maintenance level. That's how many calories your body needs in a 24-hour period. That takes into consideration sleep, rest, whatever activities you're doing, walking to work, walking to your car, maybe you're going to the gym. 2,500 calories is what your body requires in a 24-hour period to maintain its body weight. But if you notice, let's say, especially during this pandemic, you have gained 10, 15 pounds in a year, and you don't know how many calories you're eating, then it's even more important for you to figure out how many calories you're eating, to figure out how much you actually need to cut in order to start losing weight, because losing weight is probably the most important thing for your heart health, because losing weight decreases inflammation. When you're heavy, and again, when I was mentioning earlier, heart disease, kidney disease, diabetes, and weight, they all go hand in hand. People who tend to be heavier around their stomach tend to be at the highest risk of what's called metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is just a collection of symptoms, representations, assessment, let's say waist, triglyceride, HDL, these types of things that tend to increase your risk of heart disease. People who tend to be heavier around their stomach tend to be at the highest risk of heart disease. So if somebody can lose weight, then they will lower their risk of heart disease. So figuring out how many calories you're eating is the most important. And then you eat 2,500 calories, you take 30% of 2,500, you attribute that to protein, 30% to fat, and 30 to 40% of carbohydrate. Let's do a thought experiment here. Does anyone who's listening to me right now know how many calories they eat per day? And if they don't, throw out a hypothetical for me. Does anyone know how many calories they're eating per day?
1,000.
Somebody knows? Somebody said 1,000?
2,000.
2,000. Okay, so that's Liz.
Yes,
Liz, oh, I'm sorry. I just
get it.
Gotcha. So 2,000 calories per day. Now, of course, this matters if you're a female, if you're a male, how active you are, and then of course all of this stuff matters. But if we're doing 2,000, I'm going to pull out my calculator here. I'm not really good at math. 2,000 times 0.3, that's 600, right? So we're looking at protein right now. So 30% of 2,000 is 600. Okay. Now this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So 600 is 600 calories. So we're looking at 600 calories out of 2,000 that's going towards protein. There are 4 calories per gram of protein. So the easy way to do this is you divide 600 by 4, and then we come out to 150. 150 grams of protein per day. Yeah. Did we get that? So we got 30% of 2,000 is 600. 600 divided by 4, because there are 4 calories per gram of protein, comes out to be 150 grams of protein per day. If we do the same thing with fat, now fat is going to be a little bit interesting, right? Because fat has 9 calories per gram. So if we take 600 divided by 9, that equals, I believe, let's see here, I believe that is like 50 something. 600 divided by 9, 67 grams of fat per day. 67 grams of fat per day. And now let's go to carbohydrates. Since we did 30 and 30, we're going to do 40%. So 40% of 2,000 equals, drum roll please, 800. 800. So 800. And then we do 800. And then carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. So 800 divided by 4 is 200 grams of carbohydrate per day. Right? So this is an interesting thought experiment. Because as I mentioned earlier, a low carb diet will typically have you below 150 grams of carbohydrate per day. But in this example, if we did 40%, we're at 200 grams of carbohydrate per day. And this is where the personalization and the additional fudging happens. After we figure out the numbers, those numbers are not set in stone. We can adjust those numbers based on how somebody's feeling, the type of progress that they're seeing, and whether or not they're comfortable eating that amount of carbohydrates. Now, if somebody is really active, 200 grams of carbohydrate at face value should be okay, because your body prefers to use carbohydrates during physical activity. That includes running, that includes cycling, that includes swimming, that includes weightlifting. Your body prefers to use carbohydrates as its energy source. But if somebody is inactive, then 200 grams of carbohydrates for 2,000 calories, especially if they are a female, might be a little bit too high. If that's the case, we might fudge the numbers a little bit, and then we might do 30 for, in this case, 2,000, we might do 30% protein, 40% fat, and 30% carbohydrates. And that would give us 150 grams of carbohydrates. So it brings down the number of carbohydrates, and it'll lift the number of fats per day. So we're just switching the 2 macronutrients, fat and carbohydrate. How was that? Was that okay so far? Did I lose anyone? Did it make sense? From a number standpoint. All right, so we got a thumbs up whoa, what happened? Oh, yeah, I just double clicked. All right, so we got a couple of thumbs up. Okay, all right. We got a question. I don't know if this is something that people are thinking about. Aside from intermittent fasting, what is the best time to stop eating for the night in general? I think that's an interesting question. I do get this question a lot. And I think it's because one of the age-old adishas, conventional wisdom, says you should stop eating at 6, 7 p.m. Right? That is one of the conventional wisdoms. I tend to not subscribe to hard and fast rules. I think we can work backwards. The best time, in my opinion, the best time to stop eating is about 3 hours, 3 hours before you hit the hay. If you go to bed at 11 p.m., then ideally your last bite is at 8 p.m. I've worked with clients who do night shifts, and there's no way that I'm going to tell them to stop eating at 6, 7 p.m. because then they have the whole work schedule ahead of them. So 3 hours before you hit the hay tends to be the ideal time to stop eating. And of course, this also depends. And, oh man, I always hate saying the word depends because it just makes it sound way more complicated than it needs to be. Nutrition is complicated. So it's complicated not because we don't know exactly what to do. I mean, we don't. But it's complicated because there's just so much information out there. It depends on how big your meal at night was. If you have a huge dinner, then you could eat earlier. You could theoretically eat earlier and before bedtime. For example, if you go to Cheesecake Factory and eat all of the chicken and biscuits, which is about 2,000 calories, then you could probably that could probably be your one meal for the day anyway. But you could probably stop eating at 5 p.m. if your bedtime is at 11 and still be okay. No, and the reason I usually say the 3 hours before bedtime is because if people eat too early or too far away from bedtime, they're going to wake up really hungry. And one of the things that I try to avoid doing with my clients, especially when they want to lose weight and want to lose fat, and they want to be able to stick to their nutrition program as long as possible, is managing hunger. Hunger is probably the number one reason why people can't stick to a nutrition plan. You get hungry, get cranky, you lose motivation, you lose energy. Your risk of injury goes up when you're hungry all the time. So yeah, we want to manage hunger. I hope that answered your question. Hopefully it did. So about 3 hours, but really but if we're going to get technical, it depends on how big the meal is. Yes, okay, great. Back to the protein, fats, and carbohydrates. Ideally, your first meal of the day should probably be your biggest meal. There's a saying, eat, breakfast like a prince, dinner like a pauper. I think there's some truth to that. Obviously, it doesn't apply to every single person. I would say a majority of people, and majority can just be out of 100 people, 51 people, that's a majority, right? So 51 out of 100 people, if we're talking about bare minimum majority, would probably see better results eating their biggest meal as their first meal. Their biggest meal being high in protein and high in fat, and that's probably where most of the carbs will be. So a typical breakfast, and this is just for somebody who might not have any allergies, they eat whatever they want, they're not vegetarian. A typical breakfast might be 3 to 4 whole eggs, turkey bacon, a cup of broccoli, 1 apple, and yeah, something along those lines, right? So eggs gives you and then maybe a quarter of an avocado. So you got the eggs, which is going to provide you with protein and fats. The avocado is going to provide you with fats and fiber. You have the turkey bacon, which is going to provide you with mainly protein. And then you have an apple, which is going to provide you with the carbohydrates. That might give you 600 to 700 calories. And then the other meals might be like 500, 400 calories. A big meal like that in the morning would probably hold you over for 4 to 5 hours. And then you might only need 1 extra meal, and then your intermittent fasting window is done. Any other questions?
David, I had someone chat me and they asked to speak to people who are intermittent grazers and they just graze throughout the day and they don't do this fasting. So what tips do you have for people who tend to be like nomadic eaters?
So nomadic eating is an interesting one because revisiting the concepts of insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's released by your pancreas, and your pancreas is an organ. The pancreas will detect when food comes into your system, any food that comes into your system, because the pancreas will release hormones, including insulin, that are responsible for breaking down food. When you eat something that has carbohydrates in it, it doesn't matter how much. It could be 1 bite of an apple, or it can be 2 bowls of pasta. Your body will detect the carbs coming in, because as soon as what's interesting? Research has shown that just by thinking about food, if you start salivating, your body will release insulin because it's going to anticipate food coming into your body, because we've conditioned ourselves to expect food at a certain time, whatever. So that's one thing. From a physical standpoint, as soon as food touches our tongue, especially sugar or carbohydrates, the pancreas will start releasing insulin. It will start releasing digestive enzymes in anticipation for the carbohydrates to come down into our esophagus, go into our stomach, and then eventually go into the small intestine. What happens is when those carbohydrates, the sugars, get into our small intestine, that's when it gets diffused out into our bloodstream. When it gets into our bloodstream, our blood sugar, the amount of the concentration of sugar in our blood starts to rise. The insulin that was released by pancreas is responsible for taking that sugar that's in the blood and shoving it into the liver, into muscle tissue, and into fat tissue. That's what insulin is really responsible for. As I was alluding to, though, it doesn't matter. Your pancreas will release insulin regardless of how much carbohydrates you eat. Obviously, it'll release more insulin as it detects more and more carbohydrates coming in. But for the intermittent grazers, if you eat foods that have sugar or carbohydrates in it, your body will release insulin. The idea behind intermittent fasting is you want to reduce the frequency in which your body releases insulin. In the mind of low carb proponents who believe that it is the best way to manage heart disease and diabetes, a higher magnitude of an insulin release is actually healthier than a high magnitude but low frequency of insulin release is actually healthier than a low magnitude but high frequency of insulin release. I don't know, does that make sense? So even if you have big meals that prompt a big release of insulin, that's healthier than if you had a bunch of small meals that prompted the release of little amounts of insulin. And the idea behind the theory behind that is, for most people, no matter how much insulin your body releases, your blood sugar will return to a baseline level in about 2 hours. So in a healthy person, it'll be about 2 hours. So for someone like me who's active and I manage my stress, my baseline blood sugar levels, no matter what I eat, I could eat 2,000 calories or I could eat 500 calories. It'll be back to baseline in 2 hours. So that is the idea. So if you have 2 big rises throughout the day, that's much healthier, according to experts, than a bunch of insulin spikes throughout the day. So if you're going to be grazing, though, I would turn towards snacks that have as little carbs as possible. It's really difficult because there aren't that many snacks out there that are low carb. But nowadays, there are snacks that are geared towards keto, where the snacks are high in fat and low in carbohydrates. One prominent example that pops up are cheese balls. They're dried cheese balls. I don't eat them. My kids freaking love them. I don't eat them, but they're dried cheese balls. Certain forms of beef jerky can be beneficial. A lot of beef jerky nowadays, especially the really popular kinds, are high in sugar. But there's a type of aged beef called biltong, biltong. It is a South African delicacy in which they slow age and smoke beef sirloin, and it is really, really high in protein, really, really low in fat because it uses sirloin. So if somebody wants to do a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet and they have no problem eating dried beef, biltong is a really good example. You can also do hard-boiled eggs. You can also do nuts. People have to be very careful with nuts because nuts can be a slippery slope for some, because it's a very addicting food for some people. But if we're talking about optimal heart health and weight management, you want to avoid things like chips or chocolate bars or granola bars, yogurts, and things of that nature. And those are usually the foods people tend to graze and snack on. I hope that answered your question. I know it was a roundabout way. I tried to explain the scientific rationale behind why grazing might be less optimal than big infrequent meals. And of course, that applies to people who might not have a really serious case of acid reflux or GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. People who have GERD might not be able to do big meals, but if you don't have GERD, this could be a method, an approach that you can consider. All right, I think we're okay with the nutrition part. Holy crap, it's an hour already? Did I talk for that much? Oh my God.
It's riveting. It's great. Can we go on?
Oh my God.
Please
Oh
go
God.
on.
That's so embarrassing. I'm so sorry. I know people are like, oh man, he's going to talk about exercise. He's going to talk about stress management. An hour later, it's like, I talked about any of those things. I'm so sorry.
Well, the good news is that we're on Facebook Live, so people can come in and out of the Zoom room as they need to, and they can always catch a replay on Facebook Live or on your YouTube channel or on our YPL YouTube channel. So we can just keep going to cover the topics we need to cover.
Oh my gosh,
yes,
I
let's
hope people aren't following it.
About heart rates and target heart rates, how to figure out your own pulse and the cardio exercises. We don't have to do any examples, but you could speak to them at least.
Gotcha. Okay. This is an interesting one. One of the newer developments when it comes to heart health is what's called HRV. It stands for heart rate variability. All that means is oh, okay, great. Somebody says, as someone who's done research on nutrition as well, a lot of the information I've heard before, and this is 100% true. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. You know, one of the biggest concerns is that I show up in one of these things and I'm an absolute imposter. I have imposter syndrome, and even though like all my clients say, oh, you're great and you help, and my clients see good results, there's always this fear that I'm going to lead people astray, and I don't want that to happen. So if I do say something, I don't claim myself to be an expert. I'm sure I know more about nutrition and exercise and fitness than the average person, but that doesn't mean that I know everything. So if there is, like what Chris did, Chris pushed back on me earlier, asked me a question about the sumo wrestlers. And I think that's a really good learning opportunity for all of us. So I appreciate if you ask me questions, if you have feedback, if you say, hey, Dave, that doesn't sound right. Maybe I will say, you know what, you may be right. Let me go research on it a little bit, come back to you. And then I think it's good. It's just a learning opportunity for all of us, right? I hope that's one thing we can walk away here with, is that we don't know everything, especially me. And so then so heart rate variability in short just means how much variation does your heart rate have on a day-to-day basis. And the best way, and the key way to do that is to take your pulse as soon as you wake up. You wake up, your eyes are open, don't even get up, take your pulse and figure out what your pulse is on a day-to-day basis. If you have a heart rate variability over 10%, that means that there are certain factors or stressors in your life that are calling for your attention. The heart rate variability is a very relative thing. We don't look at heart rate, HRV does not look at absolute terms. It just looks at how is your heart rate changing on a day-to-day basis. This looks into your sleep, how much you're sleeping, the quality of your sleep, how deeply you're sleeping. So heart rate variability is, I think, an interesting and very fast and efficient way of looking at your heart health. And all you got to do is take your pulse every single morning. You just take a journal and be like, okay, my heart rate was this today, and tomorrow my heart rate was that, blah, blah, blah. You want to take your pulse. There are obviously two ways to take your pulse. Getting your pulse is really at the foundation of any sort of cardiovascular enhancing program. There are two ways to take your pulse. You take your carotid, but you don't want to do your carotid because that takes blood and oxygen up to your brain. So you don't want to do that. Even though you have carotid on each side, you can take the carotid on one side, but I wouldn't recommend it. The safest and equally effective way is to take your pulse right on your wrist. So you have these two tendons right here. Take your two fingers and above the top tendon right here, and you just take your pulse. And what you do is you set a timer for 15 seconds. You take your pulse for 15 seconds, and then you multiply that by 4. How about we do an experiment and we take our pulse right now? You don't have to tell me your number, but I'm gonna keep time for you. Let's do an experiment. If nobody here has taken their pulse before, you have no pulse. That's okay, Z. We'll just assume that your pulse is 0 and that you're a robot. All right. So let's try taking our pulse. And you don't have to. You obviously don't have to participate. If you don't want to participate, you don't have to. I used to be one of those people in school when they're like, "Oh, let's do an exercise." I would just sit and not do anything. I was a loser that way. All right. So we're gonna take a pulse. Okay. So right up here. Okay. You feel the pulse. Hopefully you feel that little pulse. Unless your name is Z, then you have no pulse. Okay. We're gonna start.
Somebody told me they're having difficulty. That's why I said I have no pulse, LOL. I was making a joke to cover, they private chatted me and they said that they can't find it.
If you're a little bit older, it might be a little bit more difficult to find your pulse. But you try not to have your hand above your head. Try to keep it right here. Ideally, you want to keep it at about this level, and then take your pulse right here. Hopefully you have your pulse. So the neck technically is better, but not by much. There's really not much of a difference. If you're generally healthy, or if you don't have peripheral vascular disease, then you should be able to find your pulse. But if not, it's fine. But we're going to take the pulse, and I'm going to start the timer in 3, 2, 1. Boom. 15 seconds. You could use a stethoscope. That's your heart rate. Pulse might be a little bit different. It might not be the same. So remember, we're holding here 15 seconds. Okay, and done. 15. So check that number, and then you're going to multiply that number by 4. So is anyone brave enough to give me their pulse number? If not, that's fine too, and I'll multiply that number by 4. So 80. Is that 80? That's 80 over the course of, if you multiply that by 4, right? So your pulse is 20. Yep, so 80 beats per minute. Yep, 20 times 4, 80 beats per minute. That's, when we're looking at absolute numbers, that tends to be kind of high. But it also depends on the time of day. Our pulse tends to be higher. Our blood pressure tends to be higher at night. And of course, depending on if you had just finished with a work day and your work day was really stressful, or maybe you just got back from the gym, your pulse will tend to be higher. And if you just ate, your pulse will tend to be higher because your body is heating up, your blood is circulating, and your body's breaking down food. So my pulse, my heart rate is 57 or 58. Ideally, you want to be between 60 and 65 for most people, if whatever. But again, I work out on a regular basis. I work out 30 minutes 5 days a week. My working out is pretty consistent. I would consider myself to be pretty good at managing my own stress. So I think all those factors are really important. So that is really the baseline. You want to be anywhere between 60 to 65 beats per minute. In the morning, you want your heart rate to be at its lowest. You want your heart rate to be at its lowest in the morning. And then you're looking at heart rate variability. You want your heart rate variability, your day-to-day heart rate in the morning when you wake up, to be anywhere but less than 10 to 15% variability. So if your heart rate is 60, you don't want to go above 66, or you don't want to go below 54. All right. So now that we know how to do your pulse, I hope everyone at least has an idea on how to get their pulse. Then we figure out, okay, when it comes to cardiovascular enhancing workouts, exercises, where should my pulse be? When you do work out, you want to take your pulse just to see where your heart rate is. And then once you figure out where your heart rate is, then you can look at the range, the thresholds, because there are various thresholds for cardiovascular. So they're called heart zones, cardio zones, heart zones. And these zones will denote how hard your heart is working in terms of beats per minute. And the beats per minute will dictate what type of benefits you're going to get from that specific heart rate. Now, this is geared towards an elevated heart rate through exercise. If your heart rate gets elevated because you're getting stressed out and you're getting angry because maybe your partner, or your boss, or your kids, or your pet piss you off, that's very different than increasing your heart rate through brisk walking or running or an aerobics class. Let's just keep that in mind. Just because your heart rate is up doesn't mean you're always going to get the same benefit. So the different zones, depending on who you ask, the different zones are anywhere between 60 to 75%, 75 to 85%. I'm going to break down all these percents for you. You got your heart, you got your pulse. Pulse is really important. Now we want to get your estimated maximum heart rate. Your estimated maximum heart rate is the most beats per minute your heart can sustain before you get too much, right? Because there's always too much of a good thing. It's like a car. If you slam the pedal to the gas, if you slam the pedal or the gas pedal, eventually your car gets to a point where your engine cannot take that stress. The heart is the same way. Your estimated maximum heart rate, this is the easiest formula. You take 220 and then you subtract your age into it. So 220 minus your age. So if you're 220 and you're 50 years old, 220 minus 50 is 170 beats per minute. That is your estimated maximum heart rate. That 170 beats per minute for a 50-year-old is theoretically the most your heart can sustain in terms of intensity for a short amount of time. If it goes above that, you can become tachycardic. Your heart, I won't say that your heart will fail, but it's really, really stressful and it will take a lot longer to recover. A lot longer to recover. What does that mean? We'll talk about that now. So we'll talk about after we figure out what we're going to do with this maximum heart rate. So if you're 170 beats per minute, then you're going to look at, well, okay, now I know my maximum heart rate. What do I do with that number? When we're looking at maximum cardiovascular benefits, there's a wide consensus in the fitness community, in the certification processes, that anywhere between 75 to 85% of your maximum heart rate equals the best cardiovascular benefits. 75 to 85%. So let's take that number, 170 times 0.75. That's 100. We're going to round that's 127.5, but we're going to round that up to 128 so then let's do the high end, 170 times 0.85. That's 144.5, so 145 beats per minute. So for our theoretical friend here who is 50 years old with an estimated maximum heart rate of 170 beats per minute, he or she wants to be at 128 to 145 beats per minute for maximum cardiovascular benefits for at least 10 minutes straight. At least 10 minutes straight. At least 10 minutes straight. Okay, for how long is it best to maintain there? So you don't want to maintain the maximum heart rate. You want to be at the percentage. Oh, okay, great. You want to be at least 10 minutes straight. Ideally, 20 minutes is ideal for general fitness people who are in decent shape. If you consider yourself to need some improvement with your health and fitness, maybe you just want to get started, try to maintain that for 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Work your way up slowly, slowly, slowly. 10 minutes is kind of the minimum threshold. Once you hit 10 minutes, you're like, yay, I got 10 minutes. Give yourself a pat on the back. And then eventually work your way up to 20 minutes. Yeah, 10 is a lot for a beginner. That's why I said, look, you got to work your way up to it. But remember, that is for maximum cardiovascular benefits. That range is for maximum cardiovascular benefits. You can still get cardiovascular benefits from the lower end. And this is what I usually recommend to people who are just starting out. 60 to 70%. 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate. Okay? So 170 times 0.6. That's 102 beats per minute. 102 And then if let's just do 102 to 75%. So 60 to 75%, that'll be 102 to 128 beats per minute. That's 60 to 75% of your estimated maximum heart rate. And you want to maintain that for at least 20 minutes. So the minimum threshold for that is 20 minutes. 60 to 75% beats per minute of your maximum heart rate for at least 20 minutes. And you want to work your way up to 60 minutes at a time. Again, this is consistent. This is an average. And this is, if you are just starting out with fitness, 60 to 75% is where you want to be. Start at 60% at the low end. So how do you know whether or not you're in this heart rate? Well, you take your pulse. You can either take your pulse while you are working out. So one recommendation that I give to my clients is to go for a brisk walk. For most people who are looking to improve their fitness and are generally sedentary, a brisk walk will be more than enough to get their heart rate up. So maybe do whatever activity for 4 minutes. For 4 minutes, or 5 minutes. For 5 minutes, do it for 5 minutes consistently. And then after 5 minutes, stop and then take your pulse and figure out where your heart rate is. And then if your heart rate, and then you make some adjustments. So let's say you're brisk walking, you brisk walk for 5 minutes, 5 minutes, stop, take your pulse, 15 seconds times 4. And then you figure out what your beats per minute is. And then you continue either doing that in terms of the intensity, or you lower. I think a great way to get started is, I know this isn't usually the popular recommendation, but if you go to the gym and you do a treadmill or you do a bike, any machine that gives you how fast you're going will, at least if you know how fast you're going, at a certain, let's say you're on the treadmill, you're going at 3 miles per hour. At 3 miles an hour, your pulse will be at a certain number. So that's a good way to start. Go to the gym, get on a machine, figure out how long you need to be on that machine in order to get your pulse to a certain level. So if at 3 miles an hour, your pulse is at 75% and it's really difficult to maintain, knock it down to maybe 2.7, 2.5 miles an hour so that you can bring your heart rate down into the 60 to 75% range. So exercise, anything that has you moving consistently. When it comes to heart health, if somebody is just getting started with fitness, I do not recommend weightlifting. I don't think you need to lift weights in order to have good heart health. If those centenarian societies, the Okinawans, the Greeks, the Italians, the Seventh-day Adventists, if they're any indication of how weightlifting can help with heart health, it doesn't. Weightlifting does not help with heart health beyond making sure you're not smoking, managing your stress, not overly drinking alcohol, eating vegetables, not eating too much. Weightlifting does not impart any additional benefits to your heart health, or strength training or working out or high intensity exercises do not impart any additional benefits to your heart than just living a sensible, healthy lifestyle where your nutrition, you know what you're eating, you know how much you're eating, most of your stuff is good, you're doing some regular, maybe low to moderate intensity cardiovascular work. That means going for a walk with your friends around the neighborhood for 20 minutes. That could all be it. And then, of course, stress management. As I alluded to earlier, if you get angry, your heart rate is going to increase. If you can learn how to manage anger or learn how to manage any emotion, anxiety, depression, where your heart rate goes up, if you can learn how to manage that and keep your heart rate lower, then your daily heart rate throughout the day will be lower and you'll have less heart rate variability. So I got another question. For a beginner, what's the best route, cardio or LIIT? Low intensity interval training, low intensity? I wouldn't consider interval training I would consider low intensity. Let's just say low intensity, brisk walking, easy cycling, water aerobics, anything that has you just go, anything that gets your heart rate up and your breathing labored a little bit, but not too much, I think is the best way to go. And I think a lot of us will intuitively know what type of activity would be best for us in that, going that route. So yeah, I think low intensity would probably be the best. Low intensity, long duration. There's an inverse relationship. So the harder your workouts are, the shorter they should be. The easier your workouts are, the longer they should be. All right, so that's exercise. Do I have any great books on exercise? Not really. I think when it comes to exercise book recommendations, they're all roughly going to say the same thing as what I said. If you want to learn more technical stuff of exercise, then I would, let's see here, do I have any interesting books about exercise here? I have one here. It's a decent book. I like this guy. He is a researcher. He's also a professor at Lehman College in the Bronx, so he's close by. His name is Brad Schoenfeld. The book is called The Max Muscle Plan. The Max Muscle Plan by Brad Schoenfeld. See, I'll type his name, Schoenfeld. This is a good book. It is geared towards weightlifting, but he also has some interesting, some very conventional recommendations on cardiovascular work, on nutrition. But if you want to start getting into lifting, I think that's a good place to start. Somebody asked me, what do you think about kettlebell instead of a weight? Kettlebell is interesting, right? Because it's considered a free weight. Let me show you what a kettlebell looks like. This is a kettlebell. Yeah. So it looks like it's a cannonball with a handle. This is 44 pounds. It looks like a cannonball with a handle, and you could do all sorts of various exercises with it. Let me see if I can show you. Can I show you an exercise here? Yeah. Okay, so if I take this kettlebell, boom, boom, and then I hold it right here, and then I come down into a squat, boom, and then you just go up and down into a squat. This exercise with the kettlebell will work your legs, and because I'm holding the weight up here in front of me, it works my arms, it works my shoulders. Because the weight is in front of me here, it's also going to work my abdominals. So there are various exercises you can do. The thing with weightlifting, and this is why I did not recommend weightlifting when it comes to heart health and cardiovascular health. Weightlifting is in essence interval training, because there's only a certain length of time you can lift before your muscles start fatiguing. Muscle fatigue is probably the limiting factor to lifting your heart rate and keeping it steady. If you go on a walk or you're cycling, you can do it for a very, very long period of time at a continuous intensity. But when it comes to weightlifting, muscular fatigue will prevent you from, you're probably not going to squat for 20 minutes straight, even if you don't have any weight. So it could be really difficult to maintain something like that. But if you're comfortable or you want to do some sort of weightlifting in conjunction with the cardio work, I think it will impart different benefits. It won't be a game changer. It won't be a deal breaker. So you can either do it or you don't. Yeah, so around the world might be what you kind of do this and you go like this, those are halos, but around the world you got this, and then you can take that weight and you can go in between the legs. Exercise like that can definitely get your heart rate up. But again, I think it just goes back to how long can you do a particular exercise for? Can you get your heart rate up, and can you keep your heart rate elevated at 60 to 75% for at least 20 minutes? That's the key thing. Can you lift it to 60 to 70% and maintain it with whatever exercise you choose? That's where really, for general fitness, that's where the magic, that's where the sweet spot is. Ooh. All right, exercise. I think we're good for exercise. Do we have any more questions with exercise? We are at an hour and a half. I see. We still have most of the people here. I don't know if you want to stop it here, Z, or if you want to continue for the next few minutes to talk about the emotional and psychological stuff.
I think the emotional, psychological stuff, especially with COVID going on, is really important. So if you could give us like some kernels of wisdom, you don't have to go full blown, but something, best practices would be really helpful at this time.
Okay. So for me, there are a lot of best practices when it comes. This is actually, the mindset stuff is actually what I think I am strongest in when talking to my clients. Simply because when it comes to nutrition and exercise, there's a finite amount of knowledge that you just really need to know. Like, okay, we eat this, eat that, do this, do that. And then we have the data, we're looking for these numbers. That's great. When it comes to the mindset stuff, every single person is different. Every single person will respond to a particular event in one way. For example, like COVID is a prime example. Some people get super depressed, and mental health has plummeted because of COVID. But I know people who are happier because of COVID, because whatever situation that they were in before the pandemic they're not in that situation any longer. For me, let's say, taking me for an example, even pre-pandemic, I wasn't that stressed. I love being a personal trainer, so work stress was not a thing for me. I'm very fortunate that way, and I don't take it for granted at all. But one thing that was stressing me out pre-COVID was I wasn't spending time. I have two kids. They're 3.5 and 2.5. I wasn't spending that much time with my kids. And I wanted to spend more time with my kids, because growing up with a single mother and an absent father, I didn't want that for my kids. I didn't think I was leading. I didn't think I was giving them that sort of life, but I wanted to spend more time with my kids. Come COVID, pandemic hits, people don't feel comfortable going to the gym. And now we don't have a nanny, kids don't go to daycare, and I spend almost every waking hour with my kids. I still do appointments here and there. I'm part-time. Before I was doing maybe 40 to 45 sessions a week. Now I'm doing 15 to 15. I spend so much more time with my kids, and I would say my mental health is better during COVID than it was before. But that's not the case for a lot of people. So when it comes to the mental health stuff, the number one thing that I usually recommend to people is if there's no stigma behind it, or if it's possible, see a therapist. They have all sorts of they have online and virtual offerings for therapists. There's a company called BetterHelp. If somebody is isolated, and that's the case with a lot of people, if somebody's isolated, and even if they're not isolated, if you don't feel comfortable talking about your issues with other people, then an independent mind like a therapist could help. It could help. It depends on what you're suffering from, or depends on what's on your mind. I have a lot of clients who are anxious because maybe before the pandemic they had a particular lifestyle they were leading, and now they can't lead it anymore. They get really anxious. Some things that can help are cognitive behavior therapy, CBT. So cognitive behavior therapy is a method of therapy that you can practice on yourself. It's obviously better if you see a practitioner or somebody who is actually a licensed psychologist or a psychiatrist who understands CBT. But the idea of CBT is battling irrational thoughts. And in a pandemic, we're probably going to have a lot of irrational thoughts because we're probably spending a lot more time with ourselves, and we're not rational creatures. We're creatures that rationalize, and as a result, we tend to also have irrational thoughts. CBT is a way to combat irrational thoughts. There's also another method of self-therapy that you can do. I mean, obviously, all these types of therapies can be administered from a practitioner, but also there's another one called ACT. It's short for acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's a spin-off of CBT. I have a very good book by a researcher named Stephen Hayes. It's called A Liberated Mind: How to Pivot Towards What Matters. He is the creator of ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. And what he really tries to do, and acceptance and commitment therapy has a really strong track record for depression and anxiety. really helps battle irrational thoughts to put things into perspective. And when we mean putting things into perspective, trying to look at your issues as an outsider, right? Trying to detach yourself from what's going on at the moment, like a pandemic, detach yourself from the pandemic. People are suffering from the pandemic, but as an individual, what could we have done to prevent the pandemic? Nothing. What could we do right now to prevent the pandemic? There are certain things we could do. I'm not going to go into that. And how are we going to manage life after the pandemic? Some of these things are within our control, but the best way to get control over our thoughts and our behaviors, a good way is to look at things as an outsider. And also, not everyone is going to be anxious or depressed. Some people might engage in self-destructive behaviors. Acceptance, commitment therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, they tend to be pretty effective for people with self-destructive behaviors. There's also another type of therapy called dialectic behavior therapy, DBT. And these are all ways to combat irrational thoughts, combat behaviors, and most importantly, and this is the big thing, as a coach, as a personal trainer, one of my things is to help decrease what's called ambivalence. Now, ambivalence is when we hold a certain thought, but we act in opposition. So let's say our thought is, hey, I want to lose weight, but we decide to go to Cheesecake Factory and down a whole plate of meatloaf with a margarita and a cheesecake. That's not going to help us reach our goal of losing weight, even though we want to lose weight. That's ambivalence, when there's a disconnect between what we actually want and what we're actually doing. It's a lot more difficult I think ambivalence is probably the number one reason. And when I say number one reason, this isn't just a minor majority. This is I would say 8 out of 10 people I work with suffer from ambivalence on a consistent basis. They have one thought, do something completely different. So their values and their morals aren't aligned with their behavior. So if we can figure out a way to first of all, if you could figure out a way to be more aware of your ambivalence, that is probably the best way you can start addressing it. Say, oh man, I have this thought and I'm not acting in accordance with that thought. Is this, what do I do? First of all, is ambivalence something you want to address? Some people are aware that they're ambivalent, but they don't care. They don't want to change, and that's okay. It's not my job to make you change. It's your and my job to figure out, all right, do I want to change? And if I do want to change, what needs to happen? Step one, be aware that there's some ambivalence going on. You have some thoughts that aren't aligning with your behaviors. And then after that, you figure out, all right, where can I start? What thoughts, what behaviors can I start modifying? And then you start from there. So I think when it comes to the emotional stuff, usually it starts with action. You behave in a way that you behave in accordance to what you want to achieve, what your intentions are. And I think that will help out a lot. There's also a saying, I like it a lot. Don't wait to be motivated to act. Act in order to be motivated. And the essence of that message is it's easier to be more motivated when you build up momentum. And the best way to build up momentum is to act. It's kind of like if you see a rock, how's that rock going to move? It's the law of inertia. In the beginning, it's really, really difficult to move an inanimate object, especially if it's heavy. If you've had certain habits or inclinations for years, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to switch gears. It's like a big ship trying to turn. But I think once you get things moving, you're going to find it easier to maintain that momentum. But it starts with starting small, and it starts with acting. And one last thing. Even though I just said, once you get things moving, things become easier, that flies in the face of conventional wisdom that dictates maintaining weight loss is really, really difficult. they say, it's one thing to get started. A lot of people can get motivated to lose weight for 30 days. A lot of people say, yeah, you know what? New year, I'm going to lose 20 pounds, blah, blah, blah. But then they find it difficult to maintain their goals or maintain whatever motivation. So that flies in the face of what I just said, right? If we consider why somebody decides to act, then I believe motivation becomes a lot easier to maintain. And I believe the main reason why people find it really difficult to maintain their progress is because of ambivalence. They have not addressed their ambivalence. Even if somebody truly believes that for a New Year's resolution they want to lose 20 pounds, they haven't really become more mindful of what they truly want to achieve. It's just kind of like a band-aid over a wound. Hopefully that makes sense. So addressing the disconnect in behaviors and thoughts and actions, and being aware of them, I think is probably one of the best ways. And acting. Is that okay?
That was great, David. I got a lot of private chats in the comments, and it was really motivational, inspirational, and real. And you gave us a lot of options to do some research on and to find some qualified people to talk to, because you're qualified and you're lending your expertise, and sometimes things are bigger than ourselves and we need to get help, and it's really important to know when we need to get qualified help.
There's just so much information out there. I have so many books. I have over 300 books, right? And I've read most of them. There's just I probably, and I'm sure this is the case with a lot of people. I'm sure there are people who are listening to this. They are experts in their field. I'm considered, maybe I know a little bit more about fitness and nutrition than the average person, but I'm sure there are people who are in here who've been doing what they've been doing for decades, and they know their profession inside and out like the back of their hand. And I'm sure a lot of people have forgotten more than what they learn. It's because they just know so much. When it comes to emotional health, I just feel that with health, there's so much information out there, and everything can work if we put the work in. But it's, people make the mistake that just because you gain knowledge that all of a sudden your life's going to change. It's like we have to figure out a way to act. And that is really, I think, where the rubber meets the road. And I don't have the answer for every single person. I don't know what's going to motivate Chris just by answering one of his questions. If I sat down with him for an hour, maybe I can figure it out. Liz, Wally, Jackie, Sumi, all these people, everyone ticks a different way. And, based off of what you said, yeah, I think there needs to be individualized help. So I think reading helps, but then, the work begins after you gain the knowledge.
So true, David. So true. We really do appreciate you. We appreciate you spending all this time with us, sharing your knowledge, answering our questions. We're excited that you're committed to come back again next month. So we look forward to figuring out what that topic might be. If anybody wants to give suggestions, you can either email myself, z@ypl.org, or David, you gave your email before, but can you give it once more?
Yes. Okay. So here it is, David@strongbiley.com.
Yes.
There you go. Yeah. So just maybe one recommendation is, David, stop talking so much. Stop talking so much. And you're not funny. Stop laughing at your own jokes. Nobody else is laughing. All right, I'll stop.
We got lots of thank yous, so no worries there. And, everybody has a slightly different sense of humor. And Chris just wrote, he likes, we like to hear people. Yes, it's all good. All right. So on that high note, I want to thank each and every one of you for coming. Thank David again for being here. Our next session, we have to look at the March calendar. It's going to be on March 9th.
We did this for an hour and 45 minutes. I am really thankful. I appreciate everyone for sticking it through.
Well, we appreciate you. So together we're better, and it's nice to know that there are kindred spirits out there. So go forth, work out, try your best, try to eat as healthy as you can, and come with all your questions for next time.
Teamwork makes the dream work. Woo!
Exactly. So everybody have a great night, and until we meet again.